everybody. This is Natasha Helfer. Welcome to Mormon Sex Info. I am very excited to have the following guest with us. His name is Ian Easter, and got to know Ian kind of through my ASEC circles as far as educational places where we meet up with fellow clinicians who are training to become sex therapists, and excited to get to know you, Ian, because as we chatted through different case presentations and different information, it became pretty clear that we come from similar backgrounds in the sense of kind of religiously conservative backgrounds. So I come from a Mormon background and you come from
a Baptist or evangelical background.
Baptist, yes, right. And so I had invited you to come on the show basically to share a little bit of what it was like to grow up in your community, especially as a gay man, gay child, gay adolescent, and then eventually a gay man. I think this is important for my audience to hear. I think sometimes as Mormons, we're all like, what the heck? This only happens in Mormonism. And I'm like, oh, no. And I know we don't totally think that, but sometimes it's good to hear what it's like in other communities as well, and in other parts of the United States, not so much in the Book of Mormon belt. So yeah, that's why I'm really just excited to have you on. Why don't we just start a little bit with just kind of a professional introduction? If you could tell us a little bit about yourself, just professionally. I know that you just retired as a military chaplain, so that's a pretty big deal. So why don't we start there? Then we'll kind of delve into more personal stuff.
Okay. So I've had a kind of varied experience in ministry, basically, before joining the military as a Canadian military as a chaplain. I started actually in student ministries at Trinity Western, which is a Christian university. I went from there, became a missionary in Turkey with the Canadian Baptist Mission Board. And then I came back and I did my Master's of Divinity at Regent College in Vancouver. And then I was a Baptist minister for a number of years throughout Canada, but also in the Netherlands. I was in Holland for a couple of years. Came back, actually did a little 6-month stint as a national manager for the conversion therapy organization that I had gone to when I wanted to be healed of my homosexuality. And then I joined the military as a chaplain. It was an absolutely fantastic experience. While I was in the military, I had the opportunity to complete a master's of counseling, psychotherapy, and spirituality from St. Paul University in Ottawa. So I worked the last 5 or 6 years as a mental health chaplain. So working within the clinics in the Canadian Forces, working with mental health issues, variety. And then I just most recently retired from the military. Am now embarking on a new journey as a full-time psychotherapist, hoping to open my practice or join a practice and continue towards certification as a sex therapist.
Yeah, right. So this is interesting because, it's hard to separate the professional from the personal.
Absolutely.
Right off the bat. A lot of what you're talking about is a lot of your personal life is tied into your professional life, because as a professional, you are espousing conversion therapy. So not only do you go through that as an individual yourself, but you become a proponent of conversion therapy yourself.
Yes.
So let's just dive in then. Let's dive in. Let's start off kind of just childhood and what type of family you grew up in, what type of Baptist community. Maybe you can help explain to us, is there a spectrum of Baptist kind of congregations? Sometimes different religions have a spectrum of like orthodoxy to progressive. Some religions don't as much. And where do the doctrines and teachings lie in regards to homosexuality and teachings in regards to people in your congregations that are identifying as such?
Okay, so there's a lot in that, and I will just pratter on, and feel free to stop me or redirect me. So I was born in the province of British Columbia and in Canada. And I would say probably couldn't get a deeper pedigree within the Baptist church. My grandfather was quite a well-known Baptist minister. My parents were Baptist missionaries and later became Baptist pastors. And so I was literally born into a religious community that really, I had no other choice really throughout my life than to follow the steps to become, a minister. And it just seemed to be the path that was set out for me. I struggled because I would say at around age 5 or 6, I began to realize that there was something wrong with me. And I use the word wrong. I felt bad. I felt that somehow I could not be safe as I was. And there was always this feeling that God did not approve of me and God did not love me, could not love me. I didn't know at the time that it was because I was gay. I just realized there was something wrong with me. And that's the best I can say it. So a lot of my journey was one of trying desperately to deny this part of me that I felt was so evil and so wrong and so bad, and do whatever kind of spiritual or religious gymnastics I could do to get God to flip that switch that I really believed that he had the power to just, flip a switch and make me straight. That was really because then I would be acceptable. And so it's interesting because I often feel like I suffered from a trauma, a religious trauma growing up. And a lot of that was because, from the very earliest age, I believed that God couldn't love me. I also believed that what the church was teaching me about homosexuality was that I could never accept this in me, this part of me. And if I did, I would be rejected. I would be kicked out. I would lose my family. And so there was a lot of fear. There was a lot of, as I said, trauma, because every time I would hear a sermon about, the evil of homosexuality or anything concerning, homosexuality or gay marriage or gay relationships or the gay lifestyle, I internalized that. So I grew up with a very deeply seated sense of self-hatred. And I spiritualized that because I believed that God, would hated my sin of homosexuality, and the church would, hate the sin. And so it was a very painful childhood. And yet at the same time, so much of it was my efforts to somehow be pleasing to God. And so I think a lot of that led towards me, becoming a minister was a big thing, becoming a missionary, working to try to get God to change me. And that led me to conversion therapy, which we can talk about. It also led me to marry a woman. And, all of this really was my endeavor to get God to change me and to make me straight. In terms of the spectrum of Baptists, we were part of what's called the Canadian Baptists, which I think would be closest to the American Baptists. So probably less, far less conservative than, for example, Southern Baptists or the Fundamentalist Baptists. We didn't handle snakes, or we weren't part of a little commune of Baptists, but we are definitely conservative. We are definitely evangelical in the teachings and the beliefs. Actually, I have been, since coming out and marrying my husband, I've been kind of kicked out or disowned or defrocked or whatever, however, from the Baptist church. And the same denomination that I grew up with, in this next week, they are voting as a denomination to deny membership to any queer people. So that's not just you can't become a minister, you can't become a leader. It's actually you can't become a member of a church. And so there's been a bit of a pendulum swing towards more conservative religious beliefs. But growing up, it was just, I grew up with kind of that standard teaching that homosexuality was a sin, just like lying or stealing. But for some reason, when it has to do with who you are and your identity, it's that much more painful and traumatic.
Yeah, of course. So, and you talk about, from a pretty early age, right? 5 or 6, kind of knowing something was askew or awry, but not necessarily having the language, right? At 5 or 6 to be able to completely be able to put it into into words.
Mm-hmm.
So at what ages do you start putting it into words? At what ages do you start connecting the dots about homosexuality being the thing, right, that was making you apart from your community. And at what point then do you also start, and do you ever come out to your family or talk to anybody about this during your adolescent years or pre-adolescent years even?
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it well. In those early years, I didn't have the experience or the language or the understanding. I just knew that there was something different. I have memories of, for example, seeing a Playgirl magazine when I was back in the day when they were at like grocery stores, and I just, as a probably 7 or 8 year old, I was just stumbled upon one, and I was just immediately drawn to the images. I developed crushes on male babysitters or people that, friends of my parents and people at church. I went to, summer camp, and I had these crushes on my counselors, but I was never actually kind of sexualized. There was never anything until adolescence. And at that point, I discovered masturbation, and I discovered forms of sexual expression. I definitely discovered pornography, and it was always the image, the men that I was drawn to. So the teenage years were really difficult because at the same time, I also was very clearly receiving the message that, homosexuality is a sin, that it's not natural, that, the other boys were interested in the girls. And so what was wrong with me, and what was going on with me was sinful and needed to be basically just, I learned to compartmentalize. And in my own way, I would try to shove this as deep as it could go, and then just put on the perception that I was a kind of a facade, that I was straight. And I really developed that. It was a coping strategy. It was a survival mechanism that I perfected. I mean, I think that's how I ended up becoming a minister and could manage to stand up in front of people. And as a minister, while all the while knowing, boy, if you knew who I really was, you would, reject me. You wouldn't, So teenage years were absolutely, as my sexuality was developing, and I realized that I was, there's, I wasn't gonna change. This was who I was. And then I would say my early 20s was the period of, okay, what can God do to change this? Because I felt deeply that God could change me, that God wanted to change me, that, God couldn't love me as I was. And so that pursuit probably in my 20s was, I went to conversion therapy. I went to some Christian therapists. And it was always within those environments that I kind of would prop the door open and let, become vulnerable enough. I would often say I'm bisexual. I'm confused. I'm attracted to both men and women, because I couldn't bring myself to say this is who I am. A lot of the therapy was really bad. I mean, it was a lot of it was, God can't accept you. It reinforced this message that, what God says about homosexuality. So, this is something that you need to deal with, because God won't accept you as you are. So.
And I'm assuming, I mean, I don't know if you remember or not, but I'm assuming these are licensed therapists in your community, in your church communities.
See, we have within, I'm not sure if it's the same in Mormonism, but we have what we call pastoral counselors.
Mhm,
They may have a master's level of training,
mhm.
but they're Christian counselors. So they're coming from a Christian perspective. And I think in many ways that would put them at odds with many of the regulating bodies and licensing bodies, because, for example, a social worker or a psychologist would have to ascribe to a code of standard of ethics and that allowed for who were queer to be free of discrimination, that you weren't allowed to whereas within the Christian or the pastoral counseling, conversion therapy, you were doing biblical counseling. So you were applying the Bible and biblical teachings to your client. And I think there's a Christian counseling association, but it's not the same thing as a regulating body, especially not like the APA or some form of, college of social workers or things like that.
Well, here in the United States, we have pastoral counseling degrees as well, that a lot of Christian ministers or pastors will go and get a pastoral counseling degree. They're planning on being like a minister of their church and want to offer some type of pastoral counseling to their congregation. So I do think they deal with that same conflict, that duality of conflict. In Mormonism, we don't necessarily have people who go to pastoral counseling school, but we do have people who do go to programs like social work programs, marriage and family therapy programs, but then will work in settings like LDS family services, kind of like Catholic family services, or will just work for themselves under private practice settings, but in a way kind of hold to their own standards, not necessarily
Absolutely.
their ethics, and I think that happens outside of Mormonism as well. I've
Absolutely.
worked in the Bible Belt for a lot of years and saw a lot of my colleagues kind of saying things like, kind of like you just described, a counselor saying in an office, imposing their God, their beliefs, their religious kind of understandings onto the therapeutic process. So that's what you're describing, is that you would come in and say, I'm bisexual, I'm wondering about my orientation, I'm questioning, and this person who's in a counseling role would say, oh yeah, no, that's not okay.
Absolutely.
That's against God's design.
Yeah.
You need to do what? So then what would they encourage you to do?
They would refer me to, a program like a conversion therapy program. I had prayer counseling where they would, cast out demons and pray against, the demonic homosexuality, the demons of homosexuality. So there was a very strong theology or belief around the fact that God does not make anyone gay or queer, and that therefore we just have to find a way for God to convert me back to the way he intended, because it's kind of my fault that God created me to be straight and heterosexual, because that's what, Adam and Eve, that's what they were, and so therefore that's God's intent. And so really it's about bringing me back into conformity with God's intent, which is a lot of guilt and a lot of shame that you put on a person who's already carrying, this weight of feeling unlovable and unacceptable. And then you add on to it, it's your fault. And so, obviously from that, what I learned how to do is perfect just hiding. And so I would say, oh yeah, thanks for the therapy. It really helped. Yeah. Oh yeah. God changed me. And I just, put on that mask and keep going.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So you're meeting with these therapists kind of on a weekly basis where they would talk to you, and then also these prayer kind of rituals where you're being prayed upon. And I'm guessing also doing a lot of self-reflection. We kind of call this pray the gay away, right? So which is kind of this righteousness meter, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to try to be as righteous as possible, which can lead to kind of some scrupulous behavior. Gonna cross all my T's and dot all my I's.
Yeah.
Try to do all the things so that hopefully I can prove myself worthy enough to God so that he can change me.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing, and keeping a lot of secretive stuff, because you can't really be who you are.
Everything was a secret. And in terms of being my authentic self, I had no idea who that was. And so there was never a sense that I could just be me because who I was so evil. The other thing that impacted me was a lot of Christian writing. So there were a lot of books at that time about homosexuality. So I read probably everything I could get my hands on. And that's really kind of set the tone for me to realize, okay, I can't do this on my own. I've got to follow either a program. So I'd start certain programs. I'd go to therapy. I'd go to this prayer counselor. I went to all these conferences. I went to Exodus conferences. There was a woman called Leanne Payne, and she was really into this prayer counseling, and then ultimately led me to a program called Living Waters, which was a, all out conversion therapy. And that's where most of us ended up when we grew up in the church. This was the program that dealt with what they called sexual brokenness and or same-sex attraction. And that was probably where, in a sense, the most damage was done, because that's really where it was kind of my last hope. This is my desperate plea. And it involved things like, coming forward and you had to, nail your sin of homosexuality to the cross. And there was a lot of very manipulative group work where you had to publicly confess and then be rebuked and have people, laying hands on you, and then you had to go forward. And it was just a very humiliating, very shame-based practice, but it preyed on our hope because, all of us who attended were desperate for God to change us. And I've had the opportunity since, coming out, to speak with, a number of the people who were participants or who were in, small groups that I led. And there's not one who says that it was effective. There's not one who was actually changed, was converted to, heterosexuality. It was just traumatic. It was mass trauma for a whole group of us. And it preyed on our desperation to become whole, to become healed, to become straight. And in a sense, a lot of the Christian therapists, I think a lot of the churches didn't know what to do with us. So it kind of became, let's just send them to this program and let them deal with them. And so it was kind of the cop out of the church as well, that we don't, it's too big an issue. And it's, and so they send us to these programs and these camps and retreats and conferences, and it's just horrific, really, when I think about it now.
Yeah. So some of these, when you say programs, I'm guessing some of these things are maybe where you would show up once a week, but some of these things were more like in depth, like you'd go somewhere for an entire week or a few weeks, and it was more like maybe inpatient.
Yeah, there was a program, and it was basically a 8-month weekly program where we'd come together, and then we were in small groups, but then every summer there was a week-long intensive, they called it a retreat, but it was, that was where there was no escape. You were embedded in this. I almost think of it as a cult now, where you were just a victim, and they did it. It was very emotionally and manipulative, but also draining. They would also do these weekend conferences at churches, where they would go into a church and they would teach about, same-sex attraction or addiction to pornography, and then they would recruit people through that as well. What's interesting is that in the last year, I don't know if you've tracked it, but in Canada, we passed legislation that outlaws any practice of conversion therapy. And the organization that I was a part of, it just what they did in response was they changed their name, and they took all the identifying factors of conversion therapy or ex-gay or anything that had to do with reparative therapy, and they just called it sexual brokenness. So it's kind of scary to think they continue to exist. They just change their name, but a lot of the programs like Exodus, I think they realize it's not effective. Like it's not actually, people aren't changing, people aren't becoming straight, and what you're doing is actually harming people.
Well, and some of the main leaders of some of these groups have come out as basically saying,
Yeah.
sorry that I've been leading this group for the last 30 or 40 years. I'm gay myself and this hasn't worked out.
Yeah.
So, and as far as the law changing in Canada, is it all together? Is it regardless of age? Because here in the United States, there are quite a few states that have outlawed conversion therapy, but it's only for minors. So there isn't necessarily a ban completely.
I don't think there's an age limit.
Okay.
Any form of coercion or any kind of programming or any kind of thing that gives a message that you can change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity is banned now, is completely outlawed. It's illegal.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think we're quite there here. I think we're only doing it for minors, which, I mean, that's protective, but as you yourself showed, you're doing this work in your early 20s, which is a very vulnerable time. Is that developing adulthood when you're wanting to fit into your community, you're wanting to possibly continue with those life markers of getting married, starting a family. And if your church community says this is the only way that you can do that, is in a very heteronormative box, and then you don't fit in there, that's extremely painful. To not know what to do next. So, okay, so you mentioned books and Christian writings, and that was influential to you. And I'm guessing this is where it also becomes more professional for you, because you're following your father's and grandfather's footsteps and becoming a minister yourself, and so becoming pastoral yourself. And so you're maybe now starting to counsel other people who find themselves in similar situations. Like, what does that start looking like for you?
It was extremely, extremely difficult, largely because, I had effectively sealed off this aspect of my life. So by the point I was actually a minister or pastor, I believed that I was straight, even though I still struggled with homosexuality. I believed that, I was like, I'd claimed the miracle and I was moving on.
And you were married to your wife at this point?
I was married. I had 3 kids. So, and I often say I wasn't suffering. Like in many ways, I was experiencing the benefit of being straight, being normal and being in the boys club and just feeling like I really belonged, even though there's a part of me that goes, I know that if I was ever, honest, or if it's ever discovered what I struggle with, that I would be rejected. So,
well, you were benefiting from the privileged population, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Privilege is a big part. It was interesting because I always loved counseling. I didn't actually want to become a minister. I didn't like leading. I really hated preaching. I felt like every time it was almost like I thought, okay, when is the lightning bolt going to hit me? Like I was like, oh, I couldn't like handle it in Christian teaching or in Baptist teaching about communion. You have to come to communion with a pure heart, and in order to receive this, you have to make sure that there's really no sin in your life. And so I always felt like I don't think there was ever a time I took communion feeling like, okay, I'm worthy of receiving it. It was always so there was this duplicity, and yet as a minister, I would connect with people in a way that, like, people would say, oh, when you preach or when you teach, it really feels like you're just one of us, and you really and I realize now it was because I was struggling so much that it came out in my preaching. But the other thing that happened was I would have, almost on a weekly basis, I would have men coming to me saying, I'm struggling with pornography, I'm struggling with this sexual issue, I'm struggling with it. And So I developed my own form of therapy, but it wasn't shame based, and it wasn't built around conversion therapy. It was built around a sense of, let's create safety for you to express what's really going on. And then I was blown away by how common it is within the church to have, like sexuality is so messed up because of the teachings and because of and so there's always this expression of shame around sexuality that's kind of programmed in, because none of us are sexually pure. So I like to think, I hope that I was never, I never got to an extent where I was preaching against homosexuality, or I was saying sexual sin is, deviant. I was always full of grace. I wanted people to feel safe. It was really it was this duality. And I just became so comfortable in it that it's like I could minister. When I became a chaplain in the military, that's probably when everything was like, okay, this is much easier, because no one in the military expected me to be some pure, token of, a purity or anything like that. And so, I found that it was much easier for me to just connect with military members, soldiers and sailors and air personnel in terms of just who they are, and be able to accept them and love them.
And you didn't go the pastoral counseling route, correct? You a master's in
divinity.
Okay.
So I became a reverend. I became a minister, and was only in those, probably my 6th year in the chaplaincy, that I was able to actually study counseling. What's really interesting is that very time, and I'm actually making a connection now, was also the time when I came out. My first real therapist was a social worker. And it was the first time in my life where I heard that it was okay for me to be gay. That messaging was so clear, and the therapist was so respectful and kind, and just accepting, and it was everything I needed. And at the same time, I was moving into a master's program in counseling. And so there was all these touch points and connections, and realizing this is what I want to do with my life. Primarily, I want to work with other queer people who've grown up in religious environments and struggled with, with where do I fit, and how do I unpack a lifetime of belief that says that I'm evil and I'm going to hell and all that. And so that's really what led me down the path of, where I am now, where, sex therapy and wanting to really work within religious community, or people with a religious background, to help to kind of work through the trauma, and often how that is lived out within their expressions of sexuality. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more in detail about those moments, right? So, because it sounds like you grow up internalizing all this theology, internalizing the fact that you're evil, that you're homosexual, that you're, that's a part of you that needs to be either hidden or converted or, done away with. And then as you become a minister, you're considering yourself straight, you've been converted, there's still these inklings, but you're just putting them on the shelf. And as you deal with other men who come in and talk about similar things, you're not necessarily giving them quite as dramatic of a hellfire and brimstone type of presentation. You're not telling them it's okay though either, right? So you're trying to be more kind of in the sense of grace. Let's just at least talk about this from a more safe perspective. But when do you start really challenging your own beliefs, and how, right? In other words, at what point and how does it start going like, wait a minute, maybe being homosexual isn't necessarily sinful in of itself, right? And what does that do to your spirituality, to your theology, to your ideas about God or yourself? And what's that journey like, and how long does that take?
Okay.
And I know that I suck at asking one question, so I apologize.
Oh, no, this is good, because I suck at answering one question and I go all over the map. So I'll tell you right now, that is a work in progress.
Mm-hmm.
in therapy right now, and we're just inching towards being able to talk about that because
Okay.
it's so painful for me. But it doesn't mean I don't want to talk about it. It just means that there's so much pain involved in that experience. I kind of go back to, so in 2012, my wife decided she didn't want to be married anymore. She had an affair, and she basically said she hated me and didn't want to be married. It wasn't because I was gay that didn't enter in. It was, she was just profoundly unhappy in her life and in many, and so we separated.
Okay.
That was for me probably the spiritually one of the darkest moments of my life, or times of my life, because I lost everything. I lost my marriage in the divorce. I lost the kids. I was posted an hour and a half away from my kids, and so because I'd lost so much, I was basically living in a ratty old apartment. I could barely afford anything, and it was so depressing. I was very suicidal. I mean, it was really, I was not well. That's when I checked into mental health myself. And that's where I met the social worker, who really, it's funny because I often think that there was a moment in our therapy that just changed everything, because I went to therapy wanting to talk about my marriage and what went wrong. Every little hints would come out about, my homosexuality and stuff like that. But I really didn't want to go there. And I came into therapy one morning and I looked at my therapist and I said, I think I'm bisexual and I need to just start dating women. My therapist, he was is a guy named Dave, and he just looks at me, he gets right like in my face and he goes, Ian, you're gay. And that's fantastic. It's such a beautiful thing about you. Like, he said it in such a, it wasn't confrontational. It was just accepting. It was like he spoke my identity into me, but with such a sense of belonging and such a sense of love and compassion and empathy that I was just flooded. And I think I had cried for a week. Just it's like the weight of that secret being lifted off me. And at that time, my spirituality became quite aggressive. I was really angry at God. It was kind of like, how dare you? I've done nothing but try to serve you, and now you've stripped away everything that was important. And yet all I've asked is for you to change me, and you haven't. So I was like, I'm done with God, I'm done. And so I kind of launched into it was horrible. It was a train wreck trying to get into the gay community at, I was 45 years old, so I was really ancient, and it was just a really not a good transition for me. But the therapy was really helping me. That therapy was about authenticity and self-acceptance and self-love, and that was such a key part. Eventually I ended up meeting a man, an incredible man. His name is Darren, and we fell in love. And it was like, it was like, this is what it's supposed to be. This is how it is supposed to be. And Darren he's just the perfect partner for me. And so we got married. But in order to get married, I had to come out to my denomination. And I knew that they would kick me out. I couldn't be gay and a Baptist minister in this denomination.
You weren't acting as a minister at the time, right? Because you were working.
I was a chaplain.
Right. But you still held that title in your church community.
And within the Canadian Forces, we have kind of this thing where your ordination, it's kind of what gives you your ability to perform as a chaplain within the Canadian Forces. So you have to have your credentials in good standing in order to be a chaplain. So I was at the time terrified that I would lose my career, but I found a little Baptist denomination out of Nova Scotia that actually was progressive and accepted gay and lesbian and queer people to be ministers. And so they took my credentials, and it created quite a storm within the chaplaincy and within the church. But so I ended up remaining as a chaplain. But that was that probably was the beginning of what led to me eventually medically releasing from the military, because there was such antagonism towards me from other chaplains,
Mhm.
um, and from the church. And it just became this suffocating feeling that I am not safe within the chaplaincy, within the church. And it kind of became universalized to any kind of religious gathering or organization. I just, I'm walking on eggshells. So eventually I left, I retired from the military. But
And you don't have to answer this if
yeah,
it's too personal, but what about the military in of itself? Just having a gay chaplain, was the military having an issue with that? Or
yeah, it's really interesting because I don't know if you're like the military right now in Canada, they're under the microscope because of, a huge number of reported cases of sexual misconduct within the military. And so there's a lot of sensitivity around diversity and discrimination and, sexual misconduct. And so they want to create the safe environment. So the Canadian Forces was absolutely, there was no problem. The chaplain branch had the problem.
okay.
And so a lot of my last year has actually been shining a light on the reality that you've got kind of this small little group within the wider Canadian Forces that are kind of playing by their own rules.
Mm.
And that is rubbing the leadership of the Canadian Forces the wrong way, understandably, because they're saying we want to be a place that everyone is safe and come as you are, and they support everyone, and they don't look kindly on the chaplain branch, saying, yeah, but we're going to hold on to our religious understandings of of homosexuality. That's the main one. On LGBTQ people, like, there's still a sizable number of chaplains who believe that that's a sinful lifestyle, and they won't do their marriages, and they will, and so it's causing a lot of conflict. And I probably a bit of a ignited the flame. I probably put some oil on the fire too, because my leaving and departure from the military was around the same time that all of this was happening. And and I was saying there needs to be some attention to the issue of chaplains within the military.
Right, right. Yeah, for sure. Okay. So, yeah, so that's right. So that's a lot. So, yeah, so you're coming into your own identity then through this process of going through your own divorce for totally different reasons, which is not, I mean, that's not typical. A lot of times how people show up in my office is through the mixed orientation lens, right?
Yes.
Mixed orientation marriage lens, where usually the LGBTQ plus partner is coming out
Yeah.
to their straight partner, right? And saying, I'm not sure how to stay married, or how are we going to stay married, or all
Hmm.
those questions. Are we going to stay married? And if so, how? And so they're doing mixed orientation marriage work within
Yeah.
my space. And so that wasn't necessarily the case for you. So so that's a little bit different. But so you have this pretty profound experience with an affirming therapist who sees
Yes.
you, who affirms your orientation, who allows for you to consider yourself for the first time as a gay man.
Yep.
And what is that like for you?
There's a sense of freedom. It's exhilarating, that authenticity, finally saying, okay, this is who I am. But it's interesting because I remember also a point in which the therapist, he made a comment kind of like, oh, well, God loves you, or God, something about God accepting me. And I held up my head and I said, I need to stop you, because you're not actually qualified to tell me that.
Mhm,
Because my entire life is, just receiving the opposite message.
mhm,
And I can't hear that,
mhm,
because, and that's, I think, has continued to be my struggle, is because where am I at spiritually? I mean, the problem is my entire spirituality was formed within a religious community that would never accept me, could never love me. And so there's a process called deconstruction. So I'm having to kind of deconstruct my faith, and at the same time try to figure out, do I throw everything out? That doesn't feel right. I don't feel like I'm an atheist now, but I also can't change religion. I can't change the theology. And so, it brings me to now I've got a fantastic therapist, and we're doing EMDR, which is new, and it's absolutely blowing my mind because it's such an effective therapy for me. But a lot of that is trying to ease and bring together in a safe way some of those formative beliefs, but with the umbrella of love, of God's love and acceptance, and actually saying, no, you're not a mistake. Like, this is exactly who God created you to be. As I said, I'm not there yet, but I realize that's the only way I can continue to find a spirituality, obviously, is going to be one that says, I'm not a mistake. I'm not evil. I'm not bad. God loves me. And part of what he loves so uniquely about me is that I'm gay, and that I'm not, I'm not heterosexual. And, so all these things, it's hard, but I realize that is the only way that I'm going to be able to salvage any kind of a spirituality or relationship with God. It has to be through a lens of God's acceptance.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting because from a training, so when I train therapists, to me, whether you're saying, God is not okay with your homosexuality, or God is okay with your homosexuality, you're still imposing God on your client. And so I think it's really important as a therapist to really step outside of our own theology, whether it's a positive God we believe in, or a negative God we believe in, or whether we don't believe in any God, right? And this is where I think it's really challenging for therapists, whether they're secular or religious themselves, so it's kind of allowing for, like you're saying, like, that's your journey. You have to decide, is God going to be part of my journey going forward, or not? Because, I'm going to go through an angry phase with God, with my God, right?
Yeah.
And rightfully so, because I was damaged.
Yeah.
And then am I going to, go an atheist route, or an agnostic route, or a deist route? And that's still my journey. And a therapist, how they ask questions has to be aligned with those kinds of possibilities, and not just assume that God is even going to be at the table.
It's interesting what you're saying, because previous to this therapist, who is probably the best therapist I've had, because she finds a way in through that, to thread that needle. I've had one psychologist who was a very religious, and so it felt like I was offending her with my questions.
Mm-hmm.
So I began very kind of couching a lot and protecting her. And, it was really bad therapy, because I was working to give her the answers that I knew that she needed, not working with my own. And then I had another psychologist who was an atheist and couldn't understand why I still struggled. Like, it's just like, God's a myth, so just, move on. So I think the key, I know. So I think the key is, and you're right on it. I think the key is to somehow be able to suspend my religious beliefs, and focus in on that. That question is, tell me about your spiritual experience, what you did with me. I mean, that's I think is the key to therapy, is kind of being able to not shying away from spirituality, not saying that your beliefs, are wrong or are right or need to be defended, but just allowing that, your client to unpack their experience. And in that journey with them, try as much as possible to just be hands off and say, okay, let's, how did that impact you? And just continue to guide the conversation, so you're not guiding away from spirituality, you're going right into it, but you're allowing them to kind of, I think, cathartically vent. This is what I believed, or this is what I was told, or this, and then you stay in that place. And I think it's very powerful. And for me, it's like, I want to use all my religious background to work with clients who have a similar experience, but not to impose anything, but simply to journey with them and say, hey, this is a safe place for you to express the pain, the trauma, the breakthroughs, however you want to form it. But I don't want to kind of shy away from it and say, okay, well, therapy shouldn't be talking about spirituality or religion. I'm like, no, it's such a formative part of who we are. We have to be equipped to talk about it.
Absolutely. That's absolutely right. I mean, spirituality and religion are super important things to be able to talk about in therapy. And to your point, we know through the research that clients will test their therapists, kind of like teenagers test their parents, right? Like, if I say this, how's my parent going to react? If my parent reacts uncomfortably, it's probably not a topic I'm going to delve into even further, right? Yep. And clients will do that with religion, with politics, with sexuality. It's like, oh, my therapist isn't comfortable talking about sex, or my therapist is comfortable talking about religion, or the way that my therapist talks about religion doesn't make me feel comfortable. So I'm going to avoid that topic or just not come back. So this is really, really important. And then how people define spirituality is also really important, because that's not always a religious term or even a God-centered term, and so I love that, that you just, those two experiences that you brought up with those two therapists is kind of at the center of the passion I have in training, in the trainings I come up with, for therapists, because whether you're religious or secular, you have this capacity for bias that I think can be really, unfortunately, damaging to that therapeutic space. So that's awesome. Well, I'm so excited that you're finding this growth and this, again, both professionally and individually. And I don't know that we can separate those. I know that every time I go through something personal, I'm like, well, there goes my professional development as well. There goes a lot of my theories and ideas that I need to now revamp or rethink. So it's an ongoing journey, but thank you so much for coming and sharing so much of your personal life. Is there anything I'm not asking you, or that I'm not delving into, that you had hoped maybe I would, or that you feel's missing from kind of this story of yours?
I don't think so. I think we've managed to, cover everything. I really appreciate the invitation. It's actually helping. It's affirming a part that there's a lot of, right now I'm kind of, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And I don't want to necessarily hang up my shingle and say, I'm ready to go. But this has helped me realize that I think I feel like I have something to offer. And so, I would definitely welcome, if there's anyone who watches this, or, I welcome dialogue or any clarity that anyone wants. I would welcome it. I'm all about community. I'm all about dialogue. And I think for those of us who have had painful religious experiences of religious trauma in whatever form, I think to realize you're not alone, but also to realize, have patience, because I think the therapeutic world is starting to wake up and realize, okay, we've tried to close off spirituality for too long, and then we did a pendulum swing into saying, okay, well, let's just call it all mindfulness, and we'll just be, mindful. I think there needs to be this middle ground where we can unpack our religious experiences within a safe environment, and in that process create new avenues of belief, or ways of existing that may include religion or may not, but within the safety of that place, being able to explore, okay, who am I really, and what gives me a sense of meaning and purpose, which is a lot of what spirituality is. So
That's
thank
right.
you
What
for having me.
you're so welcome. What's the best way to reach you if people want to reach out?
Well, I'm on Facebook, so you can Ian Easter. Can I give my email?
You can give whatever you want.
Okay, my email is iseaster. My middle name is Sherman, so Ian Sherman, iseaster @hotmail.com.
Okay. And I'll make sure and put those as well in the links.
Absolutely.
And yeah, once you get your practice going, or you have a website or whatever, let us know and we can get those up to
Great.
link them once these, because these will be up for a while, this interview. So
Awesome.
people will listen. But thank you so much, Ian, for being with us.
Absolutely.
We wish you the best in your new chapters as
Thank you.
as you go forward. Take care.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles. And as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
It's been a long road here, a trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of It's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary.
Ordinary.
No, it's extraordinary.